Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let me welcome you once again. I'm Mike Quaranta. I'm president of the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce, and grateful for all of you being here today. Our webinar this afternoon is going to look at what's next for Delaware and COVID-19, and we've got a great panel. But before I do that, let me remind everybody that we're joined today by several members of the media, and we're grateful for them joining us today. There's about 90 people on the webinar today. This is one of a series. We've had each of these speakers join us in the past, and we're grateful for their time and their dedication to keeping us all safe, and we'll hear from them in a minute. Before that, let me just mention a couple things very briefly. We've got some upcoming events coming up there on your screen. On Wednesday, September 1st, we're going to be over at the Brandywine Zoo bright and early for a networking breakfast. So come on over and say hello to all the wild critters. Then we've got an evening mixer on Tuesday, and that's on September 7th over at the Canal Side Inn, and that's the night before our Chamber Chase golf tournament. That's the next day, Wednesday, September 8th, and that's at Kings Creek Country Club down in Rehoboth. And then later in the month, it's a busy month, we have our networking station event at the Chase Center at the riverfront. Pretty close to sold out. We have reworked the floor plan to keep everybody safe. So hopefully by September 21st, we'll have a better idea of kind of where things are at, but we are all a go so far on every bit of this. Okay, those are the things I wanted to mention. Let me thank Brian DeSabatino from EDIS, who's our sponsor for today. Brian's a friend, very grateful for his leadership within the chamber, and he's a neighbor. So Brian, without further ado, let me welcome you and thank you and the company for sponsoring today's webinar.
Thanks, Mike, and should I say Mayor. I really just wanted to take a second to thank the chambers and the chamber and the speakers today. Meetings like today, presentations like today are precisely why EDIS is enthused about being a member of the chamber. You know, for the last year and a half, we've spent a lot of time designing and building great spaces all around the state of Delaware. And we were really excited to have our customers, have their employees and their customers come back to work. And the goal for everybody here is to keep them there and keep coming back. So it's great that you sponsor a day like today so that as employers, we can get a bead on what's important so that we can continue to build great spaces. So thank you, Mike, for the opportunity to sponsor today's event. It was a real pleasure.
Appreciate that, Brian, and thank you again, and thanks to EDIS. Appreciate that. Okay. Let me mention again that we're joined by several members of the media. So if people want to do follow up, I'd ask them to reach back out to Kelly on our team, and she could direct them to the appropriate people if they have questions. Our first speaker, and I'm not going to read bios because these are three very well-credentialed and very experienced people, but their bios are available on our website. But our first presenter today is going to be Dr. Marcy Dries. She's the infection prevention officer and hospital epidemiologist at Christiana Care. She'll be followed by Dr. Michael Ybarra, who's vice president of medical affairs and strategic alliances at PhRMA and an emergency medical physician. And then finally, Joe Spinelli, who's the senior vice president of product and strategy for Access DX Laboratory. So we'll start with Dr. Dries first. Marcy, thank you again for joining us. We look forward to your presentation.
Right. Thank you, Mike, for the invitation, and thank you everyone who's joined today. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about some of the recent trends of what we're seeing with COVID, the COVID-19 variants. What do we know about breakthrough cases? And then lastly, there's obviously a lot of talk right now about third doses and boosters. We're going to finish there before I turn it over. So this is a map that just really shows kind of what's going on nationally right now. I pulled it yesterday, actually. So the red obviously is the number of new cases, and the green is percent vaccination. So the bright red is where we really see low vaccination rates and thus high transmission of COVID. And as you get more and more vaccinated, you do see, that kind of dark maroon color is where we're seeing high, relatively high vaccination rates, but also a lot of spread of COVID as well. And obviously, just Texas is not reporting county level data, and there's something going on with the data in Nebraska. So don't get the impression that Nebraska is some oasis of lack of COVID. There's some data issues there. So really, what you can see is, it's really pretty widespread. This is the trend over time, and really, we haven't quite hit our peak nationally from where we were in January, but really since everything was pretty calm back in June, everyone was pretty excited about getting to go back to normal, and we've seen over a 700% increase in new cases since June. Next slide, please. And similarly with hospitalizations, we're not quite at the level where we were back in January, which was the peak, but we're certainly seeing a lot of increase. And then, luckily, deaths tend to lag behind by a couple weeks, but we're not seeing yet the same, high, acceleration of deaths that we've seen in the past. So next slide. That's not my slide. Next, please. Yeah, there we go. So, and I think what's changed a little bit with this recent surge with Delta variant is what's happening with kids. So we've been fortunate that kids in general were not as heavily affected, but we're now seeing very high hospitalization rates. The graph on the left it shows all kids under the age of 18, with obviously an exponential rise there in new hospitalizations. And the graph on the right really just breaks it down to the 5 to 11-year-olds who are not yet eligible for vaccination compared to the 12 to 17-year-olds who are eligible for vaccination. And you can see at the very right-hand side is we're seeing an equally steep slope for both of those age groups, which is disappointing. I think it just shows that we have not gotten enough of those 12 to 17-year-olds vaccinated. And again, even though we feel like, I think part of the hesitancy from parents getting their kids vaccinated is it's felt to be a very mild disease in kids. And for the most part, it is. However, we've had 131 pediatric deaths in the 0 to 4 age range and almost 300 in the 5 to 18 age range nationally. So, which is certainly way more than we normally would see in even a bad flu season. So yes, an individual risk is low, but cumulatively, just because there's so much COVID, we're seeing a lot of kids be affected as well. Next slide, please. So what's happening in Delaware? So I think it's similar to national trends. The map there on the left really shows Western Sussex and to some extent Lower Kent County has the lowest vaccination rates and thus the highest level of new positive cases. And then the graph on the right really just shows, that's a 90-day look that we're accelerating. Next, please. Our test positivity rate, had reached, was below 1%, and now it's back in the 6 to 7% range again. Next slide, please. And then obviously our current hospitalizations are higher than they've been in the last 3 months. Next, please. So what's going on with the variant? So, all viruses mutate over time, and it's just random. So these random mutations most frequently either have no effect on the virus or they actually make the virus weaker. However, if these mutations confer some advantage, it does allow that virus to outcompete what was known as the wild type virus, the original virus, or any prior variants. And so when these mutations happen, they can make the variant spread more easily person to person, which is certainly what we've seen. It can cause it to be either cause milder or more severe disease. It theoretically could affect our ability to detect the virus with our currently available tests. It might make the viruses respond differently to available treatments, and it can alter vaccine effects. So, or it can do any or all of the above. So that's obviously why we're so concerned as this virus continues to mutate. And the graph or the picture on the right just shows, often these are just single base pair mutations. The ones that we're most concerned about are the ones that affect the binding of the virus to our cells, which is through kind of the spike protein and the receptor binding domain of that spike protein. So the more changes that happen there, it affects our vaccines, and also it affects the virus's ability to attack our cells. Next slide, please. So, this on the left is national data of what's happening with variants, and it only goes back as far as May. But if it went back further, you would see a very similar trend, which is, this dark orange is all Delta. And you can see, like, really between, early May or mid-May, early June, Delta has really just taken over, so that it is the dominant variant. And if you had seen the same graph back in March, you would have seen Alpha, which is now the kind of the pale orange, had did the same thing, because it was able to outcompete the strains that were available before then. So really what we're seeing nationally is nearly all Delta. On the left is on the right is what's happening in Delaware. And this is just a cumulative report of all the testing that they've done so far. So clearly you can see we've seen a lot more Alpha because this is going back as long as they've been doing the testing. But if you look at their weekly reports, what's been reported in the last week or two, similarly is all Delta variant. Next, please. So what do we know about Delta right now? So it's about twice as contagious as prior variants, and those were about twice as contagious as the original. So we're several multitudes now more contagious than what first emerged back in 2020. There are several studies that suggest that more severe disease in unvaccinated persons, and there may be some effect on the monoclonal antibody treatments, making them somewhat less effective. And these are outpatient treatments typically that are given to high-risk people to prevent hospitalization. Like I said before, it does appear to be affecting pediatric populations more than the prior strains. But on the good side, fully vaccinated people who are infected with Delta do appear to be contagious for for shorter duration than people who were unvaccinated. So the vaccines do seem to be still having that effect, and the vaccines still remain highly protective against severe disease. So, on the right-hand side, the original COVID, we thought on average one infected person would infect between 2 and 3 other people. The current Delta variant, each infected person is infecting between 5 and 7 additional people. So it's just that much more contagious. Next slide, please. So breakthrough cases, again, this is a case that happens in someone who's considered fully vaccinated, so at least 2 weeks out from their final dose. So we certainly see cases in people who are partially vaccinated or just haven't had that time for that full effect of the vaccine. But even in someone who's fully vaccinated, it is expected that people will still get COVID. No vaccine's 100% effective. The Delta effect, I think we don't to know to what extent it is, the actual genetic changes of the virus that may be making the vaccine a little bit less effective. Is it waning over time? Or is it just the fact that these people have such high viral loads that it's kind of overwhelming your immune system because they're being exposed to such a higher level of virus than they were with the prior variants. What do we know about breakthrough cases? So nationally, between January and April, the CDC was tracking all breakthroughs, and they reported about just over 10,000 cases, of which 10% were hospitalized and 2% died. But they did look to see, and about a third of the deaths did not appear to be related to COVID. On May 1st, they actually transitioned to only tracking those breakthrough cases that were hospitalized. And so we have kind of a different set of data since then. And as of August 9th, just over 8,000 hospitalized or fatal breakthrough cases were reported. The majority are 65 years or older, so presumably have other medical issues. And about 1,600 deaths. Again, a significant minority did not appear to be related at all to COVID. They just happened to test positive. Next slide. So in Delaware, as of last week, we have over 485,000 people, Delawareans, that are fully vaccinated. So that equates to 75% of the population who's at least 18 years of age have received at least 1 dose, but 57% of the total population has received at least 1 dose, once you include all those kids that are not eligible yet for vaccination. They've reported just over 1,200 breakthrough cases, which overall equates to 0.25% of all vaccinated persons. They've reported 36 hospitalizations so far and 14 deaths. But again, those deaths are not confirmed to be due to COVID. Next slide, or next please. So That's cumulative ever since we've had vaccines. So what's been happening more recently? So for the past week that was reported, out of 1,800 cases total that were reported, 79% were either unvaccinated or only partially vaccinated. Of the 106 hospitalizations, 86% were either unvaccinated or partially vaccinated. And of the 5 deaths, 4 of them were either unvaccinated or partially vaccinated. So again, the vaccines still are, very, very effective, especially at preventing these more severe outcomes. Next slide. So I did want to take a minute, though, to just talk about what does that mean when you have, 20% of hospitalizations and deaths are vaccinated? What does that mean? So I think, you have to put it into perspective of the overall outbreak. So this was a slide that was presented at ACIP a couple of weeks ago that gives kind of 2 theoretical states, with a million population each. State A is 70% vaccinated, state B is only 30% vaccinated. And if you look at the percentage of cases that are vaccinated, you can see state A actually looks worse. 22% of their cases are vaccinated, whereas only 5% in state B. And but if you look at the total number of cases, it's 130 versus over 5,000. So the more cases you have overall, given that if you have a low vaccination rate, the lower your percentage of vaccinated cases will be, but obviously you have many, many more cases. Next slide, please. And that comes through too for hospitalizations. Let's see the bottom of the slide. Where, again, like the percentage of hospitalizations will look higher in that state that has a higher vaccination rate overall, even though the absolute number of vaccinations are much, much lower, or of hospitalizations. Next slide, please. So what do we know about 3rd doses or boosters? So what's currently recommended is for really immunocompromised people only. So they are currently authorized and recommended to get a 3rd dose as part of the primary vaccine series if they received an mRNA vaccine to begin with. If they received the J&J vaccine, there currently is no recommendation, really just because there are no data, but hopefully a recommendation will be coming soon. And it's not considered a booster because they're assumed that they never really responded in the first place to the initial 2 doses. So it's really considered a 3rd dose in their primary series. But you can see it's pretty variable, even between these different groups. The dotted line across the top is considered what happens with normal healthy controls. And even within these different immunocompromised groups, it's pretty variable. So some of them respond just fine, but many of them do not. And so these are the types of data that led to that decision to allow a 3rd dose for certain really highly immunocompromised people. Next. And then, so now, of course, the big talk, is what about boosters for everybody? So the White House obviously put that out last week, that they expect that to happen at some point. It will be discussed at an ACIP meeting next week. But I think, I think there'll be a very robust discussion about, what really are we trying to prevent with a booster? Like, are we trying to prevent all COVID-19 cases? Probably not. The reason for the surge in Delta and everything that's happening right now is not a vaccine failure issue. It's a problem that not enough people have gotten their first dose or second dose. Do we want to prevent severe cases, hospitalizations, and death? Absolutely. We want to protect those individual people, and we also want to make sure that there's room for people coming in with heart attacks and car accidents and all the other things that people still get, and are having difficulty accessing care because the hospitals are full. And I think, in terms of, even milder cases, it may make sense to prevent those in the healthcare workforce so that they can continue to work. We're not sending people out for 10 days and 2 weeks with, the sniffles that happen to be COVID, and again, to help take care of patients. So, but the data that really led to that talk about boosters comes, there was a few publications that came out a week or 2 ago. One was looking at New York, which is shown in the graph on the right, that looked at over the last 6 months or so, the overall VE or vaccine effectiveness declined from 92 to 80%. You can see the dark blue line at the very bottom is the number of cases among vaccinated people. You can see it's starting to rise, not nearly though as high as the dotted line, which is the unvaccinated people. And then they also saw a similar decrease in vaccine effectiveness in nursing home residents from 74 to 53%. And obviously very vulnerable population there. So they did also publish that studies that showed that protection against hospitalization, though, remained very strong. So that was reassuring. Next, please. And so my last slide, I think, is, really, I was asked to talk about, well, what about flu? We're going into flu season. As everyone, I think, knows, we had a nearly non-existent flu season in 2021. And I think this was due to a number of things. The fact that we were masking, we were distancing, many people were working from home. Many schools were either hybrid or virtual, and there was relatively little travel. However, once things started to open up again in kind of late May, early June, COVID was down. We really saw this late resurgence of non-COVID viral respiratory illnesses that was unusual. RSV, for example, which normally circulates in the winter, is now having a huge outbreak, parainfluenza, et cetera. So what to expect for the 2021-22 season? The thing I always say about flu is the only thing that's predictable about it is that it's going to be unpredictable. But I would expect that, given that we're not going to the severe lockdown that we did before schools are open, masking hopefully in many cases will be happening. I don't think we're going to see another non-existent flu season. So I really recommend an aggressive flu campaign. There are new guidelines that say that non-pregnant adults should wait a little bit to be vaccinated, September, October, not July, August, where sometimes vaccines are available. And there are not currently no restrictions from getting the flu and COVID vaccines, within the same period, even together if you want. But you just have to be careful about kind of the side effects, accumulating side effects from different vaccines the same day, but you can. And I think that's my last slide, so I will turn it over.
So Marcy,
back to Mike. Thank you.
Marcy, before you go, just real quick, I believe you are the Delaware representative to ACIP. Could you share real quick what that is?
Oh, sure. So I don't represent Delaware. I represent my professional society, which is the Society for Healthcare EPI. But the ACIP is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice. So it's an independent group that advises the CDC about vaccine recommendations. That's
great. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So thank you. Let's go to Dr. Ybarra. Mike, thanks for joining us. You are on, sir.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Thanks everyone for the invitation to be here today and to the co-panelists I'm with. My name is Michael Ybarra. I'm an emergency physician in Washington, D.C., and I'm a vice president at PhRMA. I think I've been with you all before. It's good to be back. Just as a reminder, PhRMA, we're the trade association that represents the innovative sector, and we're really proud of our members, a number of which are involved in developing COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines. Today, we're going to focus on vaccines, of course, and the latest happening there. But it's important to note that COVID's a different disease today for a variety of reasons, and not the least of which, of course, is vaccines, but also treatments. COVID a little over a year ago was a effectively untreatable disease. We didn't have good data on the appropriate treatments. We didn't have FDA authorized treatments. Now, of course, we do. We have FDA approved as well as authorized therapies like monoclonal antibodies, antivirals, anti-inflammatories, and hopefully more coming down the pike. Our members are investigating new therapies, a number of which are in the pipeline in each of those categories. But to focus more on vaccines, we can go to the next slide. There are several questions that we're getting, a lot of right now, and it was well covered by Dr. Dries just a few minutes ago. Of course, where are we at with vaccines and new vaccine development, as well as approvals? What does this mean for variants? How is industry approaching variants, as well as how is industry approaching booster shots and collaborating with government on that? So I'll tackle each of those in a second. My next slide I saw actually earlier, so I'm not sure if we have, oh, good, we have it. So this was the one that I think you got a little bit of a preview on a few minutes ago, but just as a reminder what we're talking about with vaccine development, a lot of people hear vaccines and they kind of think of the classic vaccine technology, which is still in use today and very, very effective. That's where you take a virus and you inactivate it in some way, shape, or form, and then that's given with some sort of adjuvant to kind of enhance the immune response. Again, that's a classic vaccine technology. It's still underway today. It works really well. It's not dangerous in any ways, but a lot of people think that's what the COVID vaccines are. And in fact, one of the main approaches that are either in development or in use right now for vaccinating Americans and folks around the world are actually these three kind of newer technologies, which are very exciting. Of course, the mRNA approach, which is basically a blueprint. You're giving your body the blueprint for just the tiny spike protein on the outside of the virus. You're not giving the whole virus. You're just teaching the body how to make and recognize the spike protein on the outside. And that's what makes coronavirus unique, are these spike proteins that make it a really good target for vaccines. Your body can learn to fight COVID just by knowing how to approach that spike protein, because that's the way that the virus gets into your cells. That's the mRNA approach provides the blueprint to your body. That's what Pfizer and Moderna are using to investigate, to develop vaccines. The second that you see right down the middle, this is what you may have heard from companies like AstraZeneca, which is in wide use around the world, or Johnson & Johnson is the one that's being used domestically, where it is actually one step ahead of that. So you provide the DNA instructions, you wrap it in an adenovirus, so it's kind of like the container that it's shipped in, and then that then teaches your body how to recognize the spike protein. It makes it, and then it recognizes that you develop the immune response, and then it all goes away. It doesn't stay in your system. It's in your body for a matter of hours to days, but that immunity lasts for a long time. The final way is the spike protein approach, and what is happening here is companies are actually making the spike protein in petri dishes, or they're making it through complex manufacturing systems. They're using moth cells and other approaches to make that spike protein outside the body, to purify it and use that in as injection. So all of these approaches are looking at ways of just teaching your body in a really powerful way how to recognize the spike protein. If you have a really robust memory against that spike protein, then you could effectively fight the whole virus. So all three of those are either in development or in use right now. If you go to the next slide, I can give a quick update on where we're at. Of course, Pfizer was the first that was authorized in late 2020. And then just yesterday, breaking news is that the Pfizer Biontech coronavirus vaccine received full FDA approval. So not an emergency use authorization. It's a full FDA approval for 16 and up. There's still an emergency use authorization in effect for 12 to 15 as they accumulate more data before kind of a supplemental application to widen the indications for that vaccine. The Moderna vaccine was authorized just a week later in December, and it is still under an authorization, but they've submitted a full application to the FDA, and if the timeline holds, and you would expect to hear back on that in the coming weeks to months. And then, of course, Johnson & Johnson is the third vaccine that's authorized for use in the US, and that one was authorized in March. It's a one-shot vaccine, so there's a lot of benefit to that, particularly me as an emergency physician. That's actually what we have stocked in our emergency department. So if someone comes to the ER and they have not been vaccinated, we're able to give that as they're being discharged from the hospital. So we have three excellent vaccines that are very, very effective, but we'll talk about how industry is approaching kind of future vaccines in just a minute. Important to note that the protein-based approach is not yet approved or authorized in the US, but there are a number of companies that are investigating that. Novavax up in Rockville, two of our members, Sanofi and GSK, are partnered on a protein-based approach, and we anticipate data from those vaccines coming out later this year. So if you go to the next slide, the humbling reality that was hit on really, really well in the first presentation is that almost all of the individuals that are dying from COVID-19 right now are unvaccinated. Quite frankly, almost all of the patients that I'm seeing in the hospital right now that have COVID-19 are unvaccinated. When I work in the ER, we're definitely seeing a lot more of COVID-19. Most of the cases that I'm seeing are unvaccinated. Of course, occasionally we're seeing some breakthrough infections. Thankfully, they're more mild, and thankfully we have things like monoclonal antibodies and other treatments that we can offer patients. But the sad fact is that people are dying from a disease that by and large they don't need to die from. And it's really, really putting a lot of pressure and strain on healthcare workers who kind of know that this is a treatable and preventable disease in many respects. And yet we're seeing a lot of unnecessary surge in volume, and then also unnecessary morbidity and mortality. So it's hitting healthcare workers particularly hard. In terms of the variants, the next major topic, of course, again, covered very well in the last segment. We've moved to this Greek lettering system. So we used to talk about variants based on where they were discovered, but of course, where they were discovered doesn't necessarily mean where they originated from. We talk about the UK variant. We don't actually know that it originated there. That just happens to be where it was first identified. So now we've moved to this Greek lettering system that correlates with where those were first discovered. So alpha was UK, beta, South Africa, gamma, Brazil, delta, India, but we talk about them in the Greek lettering system now. And of course, the Delta variant is most common in the US, highly contagious. And we're seeing this just surge of infections across the country, worse in lower vaccinated parts of the country. And of course, hospitalizations are worse in the lower vaccinated parts of the country. So if you go to the next slide, How is industry approaching all of this? How are we working and collaborating with the government? Well, a number of companies are doing what they need to do in order to be prepared and stay ahead of this COVID surge. So companies like Pfizer and Moderna are continuing their clinical trials to study what the impact of booster shots may be. They are looking at tailored, specific variant vaccines. So you can make a vaccine that is targeted against the newer variants and looking to see if that's better. Of course, you also have NIH that's studying questions like mix and match, which is a common practice in Europe, not a common practice at all in the US, or not one that the CDC currently recommends, but those questions are being studied, again, in collaboration with industry. And then, of course, last week, the Biden administration announced that they would like to have a plan, assuming that the FDA and CDC agree, they would like to have a plan to offer booster shots to most Americans 8 months after their vaccine. We all have our vaccine cards. You know, when your 8 months hit, you would go get your booster then, but we're waiting on FDA and CDC to provide an additional authorization on the FDA side, and then CDC's ACIP to meet and provide that recommendation. So kind of multiple steps need to happen, but we're looking at that as a potential rollout at the end of September. And of course, since nursing home residents and healthcare workers were first to get vaccinated in the end of 2020 and early 2021, they would be kind of first in line naturally to receive the booster shot. So it wouldn't be that there would necessarily be the same sort of prioritization, but just naturally, if you got your vaccine kind of per the prioritization, then you would kind of get your booster in that same sort of order. So if you go to the next slide, that is it for my prepared remarks. But just as I mentioned before, companies working really, really closely in collaboration with each other and also with regulators to make sure that we stay 1, 2, and 3 steps ahead of this virus. There's a lot happening, and there's obviously a lot of concern as well with what might happen. But that's why we're obviously glad and proud of our member companies for the work that they're doing to stay ahead. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here, and I'll turn it back to Mike.
Dr. Ybarra, thank you very much. Joe Spinelli, testing has always been important. Testing is probably going to ramp up in importance simply because, do I feel like I have the flu? Is this COVID? Differentiation. Am I home for a couple of days? Am I home quarantining for a couple of weeks? A lot of employers and their employees would have some of those concerns. So take it away on testing, please.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and to the other panels as well for some great insight here today. My name is Joe Spinelli. I'm the SVP of Product and Strategy for AccessDX. We are a CLIA certified, CAP accredited diagnostic laboratory provider all across the United States. We work with thousands of long-term care facilities, employer groups, state and local municipalities. So we have a really interesting front row seat to what's occurred throughout this entire course of the pandemic. And so today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of those trends that we are seeing, some of the best practices that we're seeing in active use, and hopefully give you a little guidance, particularly around what we're seeing regarding flu and RSV, which kind of gets to this quad or triple play of diagnostics that are coming down the pipe. So the first thing, just to level set, one of the things that's been very apparent and logical throughout this entire pandemic is that the diagnostic testing provides some very interesting insight on a surveillance basis of what's going on across the country. And really just to give you a quick baseline for that, and I have to be obviously very judicious in what we can share and what we're allowed to share. This is just exactly what you can see if you go to Google or the Times of where the COVID cases are. And if you can click on the next slide here, this is a really interesting, next slide, please. There we go. This is an overlay of the positivity rate that we've seen at our diagnostic lab over the same time period. And so we didn't doctor this or do anything but other just do a direct overlay of it. And you can almost set your watch to the advance notice that you get in terms of the overall case rate, looking at the positive rates that you can see through broad-based PCR surveillance testing. So again, it maintains its strength in being able to help identify, understand what's going on, but particularly help individuals and organizations get ahead of stemming the tide of potential outbreaks. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about where we're at today as a broad testing industry. And again, this does change and evolve as time goes on, but particularly compared to where we were about a year ago. Diagnostic testing availability has broadly caught up with demand. That is assuming that we don't have any other further surges in demand. But unlike about this time last year, where if you were trying to get a COVID PCR test and it was taking a week plus to get results back, we're still seeing very good adherence to the 24, 48-hour turnaround time. Our lab, for example, has been sub 15-hour turnaround time for a while now. And we are seeing a little bit of pressure now as return to work programs are occurring and as other mandates come into play, as well as certain areas trip standards that require more routine testing. But the industry and infrastructure as a whole is in a much better position than it was earlier in the pandemic and even in the last prior surges. There's a number of methodologies that employer groups can employ. PCR testing still remains the gold standard in terms of specificity and sensitivity for detection. And turnaround is, again, being pressured by variant demand, the compliance mandates, and some of the return to work programs. But what we're seeing happen is that rapid testing solutions, either through the use of a telemedicine provider and some sort of on-site administration, or just direct rapid tests, either the antigen test or some of the other ones that are out there, with a reflex to a positive PCR are increasingly being in use by employer groups. What that means is we all know that the instant or rapid tests don't necessarily have the same quality of output. More broadly speaking, if you pop positive with one of those tests, individuals will increasingly have another PCR test sent out to confirm the result of that rapid test. It offers a really good combination of speed and accuracy and again, compliance and surveillance programs. So we're seeing that the employment of that strategy increasingly in use across the country. Some of the key takeaways that we'd offer to employers, particularly at this time, is to really establish and reaffirm the relationships that you have with the providers for your stakeholder programs, both the rapid tests that may be required or providers of PCR testing. This means that programs that you may have in place for employees to be tested prior to return to work or in contact with a vaccination or testing mandate. What you're doing with visitors or customers as you increasingly want to bring other people on site, again, using all the other safety protocols that are in place and recommended. And then particularly be mindful of what's happening for anybody who's employed for international travel. Mandates on a per country basis for the countries that are open are changing daily. Some of that has to do with the relative positive rates in the country you're coming from and the country you're going to. Even if you're going to, let's say, Caribbean destinations where they've been broadly more open for individuals, subject to you having certain testing protocols upon when you arrive and when you leave, keep everyone in mind of what those requirements are and make sure that those mechanics are in place. Next slide, please. So one of the things that has continued to come out is, okay, we've recommended or strongly suggested our employer population has been vaccinated. They're providing proof of vaccine, so we're done, right? We don't need to require testing anymore. Well, the reality is surveillance testing remains a component of any vaccine program. A lot of them are the vaccine or test program that are being in place. We've seen guidance from the White House saying that every federal government employee will either need to be proof of vaccination or comply with additional requirements, including weekly or twice weekly screening requirements. There's also general pushes towards more stringent mandates around vaccination. However, as we've just explained, while vaccinations are an amazing front line to really helping to stem the tide, also minimizing the adverse effects should someone come down with COVID, it does not necessarily always mean that a vaccinated individual will not be subject to catching COVID or being part to an outbreak that may occur either within your geography or within your employer base. So maintaining some modicum of a surveillance testing activity within the organization remains prudent, and particularly for those who start to exhibit any sign of symptoms whatsoever, or someone in their immediate family or someone they've come in contact with. Next slide, please. So you've seen a little bit of that chart on the right already in one of the prior conversations, but just a little bit on the diagnostic world's view of variants, because there's been different levels of information that have been floating out there. So I think it's helpful to just level set. So the first thing that's important is how do we determine whether or not you have a variant or a specific variant of concern, versus popping positive for a COVID test. Well, there's a sequencing process that can actually be employed on positive samples to help actually look at the unique genetic signature of these specific coronaviruses. to really help identify what correlation the specific infection you have is represented by one of the known variants or variants of concern. One of the things that's been very interesting is we get this question a lot. Well, for example, our lab will preemptively sequence every positive and provide those results to the required reporting agencies to help contribute to some of the understanding more broadly of what's going on. Laboratories in general are restricted from communicating that variant information to individuals. So more often than not, we cannot tell an individual from a compliance or legal mechanic that, oh, it looks like you have the Delta variant. And there's some very good reasons institutionally why that's the case. And the most important one is that the variant that you may be showcasing does not necessarily require a change in a standard response or management protocol. There is no clinical change that a Delta variant patient has versus a Alpha or Gamma, or at least at this time. And unless we get to a scenario where we're finding really severe diversions in resistance to monoclonal antibody treatments or other standards of care, that's going to probably remain the norm. So it's important to know that it's helpful to understand what types of variants are out there, what variants are evolving, so that we can proactively get ahead of them. It doesn't change necessarily what you need to do for those individuals or what you need to do to take them out of a work environment, for example. Now, on the detection side, what's very important to know, both with rapid testing methodologies as well as PCR testing methodologies, there's multiple assays or different testing types to look at the signature of that coronavirus and determine that it is COVID. And depending on the variant that you have, particularly some of those that were showing their face in early 2021, there was some risk that those coronaviruses were evading detection. And one in particular had to do with B117 and a specific S gene dropout. A lot of those concerns have been mitigated as different assays have been updated to stay on kind of the front end of the curve of what's going on more broadly. And so one of the things that's very important for you to understand, particularly if you have whole-scale surveillance programs or surveillance programs that use certain assay methodologies, is to ask the folks that you work with where they are in terms of validating the detection of the variants of concern that are more prominent. Any laboratory or provider worth their salt should be able to help identify that and provide you with the data to confirm or affirm that they have an ability to continue to monitor that. There's also specific PCR tests that are coming out to identify whether or not the signature of that coronavirus identifies a specific variant, but there's a lot of caution that's being employed in how clinically useful those are and what the dissemination methodology is going to be going forward. So in short, keep on top of the variant trends and just make sure you check with your providers on any new variants of concern to ensure that your team is protected as possible. And we also don't run into a situation where we have a bunch of negative tests only because the PCR test or the rapid testing question was evading detection. Next slide, please. So now kind of the question we want to talk about regarding flu and RSV. There's been an increasing conversation around a diagnostic test that can test for everything, because one of the biggest concerns for both flu, RSV, as well as COVID is the patients will generally present kind of all the same way. A lot of the symptoms are universal, and we don't know if the person just has a common flu virus or if they have RSV. RSV in general healthy adult populations is not very concerning. However, there's a lot of impact to especially young children as well as the elderly populations who are already at risk for COVID and already at risk for flu. And what you have right here is a chart of the influenza so far for this year. So we are already starting to see kind of the seasonal uptick going into the end of this year. So we know that we will have a flu season this year, as it was alluded to. We don't know how robust it will be. And the CDC is actually driving a multiplexed assay approach going forward. So what you will see is a lot of the PCR testing providers are going to have to go to offering a flu COVID combo test. So as those things continue to get validated, as you see those out in the market, that is something that is going to be increasingly beneficial to help provide peace of mind to your employees, particularly as they're looking to really get peace of mind of what they have. Similarly, RSV is another a diagnostic test that can be added to a multiplexed assay for certain groups. And if you click the next slide real quick, we already know that RSV is something that is, go back one, sorry about that. There we go. So there's a chart here that shows kind of where we are in the positive rates for RSV in terms of both PCR and antigen detection. And it looks like it got lost here, but just to give you a quick comparison of the analog, That chart to the right, where it starts spiking, you see those spikes occurring in June of July of this year. We had really no RSV cases in 2020, but if you go back to the beginning of that chart, you can see the spikes typically occur in September, October, November. So we already know that we're on the upswing of RSV, and anybody anecdotally who's been talking to their daycare provider or talking to a pediatrician or talking to folks on the elderly care side already have been saying they're seeing more RSV cases now than they typically see in peak season. So it's going to be very important as we go into this to help have diagnostics as a weapon to, again, minimize ambiguity, understand treatment pathways, and effectively treat individuals with whatever they end up being infected with. Now, next slide, please. So just a couple of quick conclusions. Diagnostic testing remains and will remain a key component to the overall COVID-19 response. Even in a world with 100% vaccination, having some level of surveillance testing is incredibly important for a lot of the reasons we've articulated over the last few slides. And really, it's not an opportunity to wait for positive tests to be confirmed by positive cases. If someone's popping positive for COVID and they are vaccinated, there is absolutely no reason to not employ the same protections and protocols that you'd have. We've already heard stories out there of someone saying that they didn't feel well, but they were vaccinated, so they weren't concerned. You've already heard about the spread, particularly of Delta, and how virulent it is. It's not something to mess around with. It's not worth playing with. And as much as we are all fatigued at being in these response protocols to COVID, the ounce of prevention here is going to go a long way to maintaining an orderly return to normalcy. Continue to revisit your protocols and stay in sync with your diagnostic providers. Again, there's evolutions in tests, test accuracy, the types of things that can detect, the quad or triple play type assays that are coming out. There's a lot of great advancements, and just stay in line with those to also make sure they'll remain available despite any projected spikes or demands as we go into this quad combo COVID, flu A, flu B, RSV season. And as always, keep in line with the latest federal CDC, state and local guidance for mandates around keeping your employees and your customers safe. So with that, I'll turn it back to Mike, and thanks again for the time today.
Joe, thank you very much. Thank you, appreciate that. Dr. Dries, we'll start with you. A couple questions, and I've got a number of them here, and so if I could ask the panelists, we can just kind of roll through these quickly. Let me summarize this. One of your peers told me, Mike, in 2020, this was all new. We had to kind of learn this on the fly. We got a lot smarter as we went through last year. So here we are now with a Delta spike. Is it safe to say that, sadly, that those people that are hospitalized are probably in real trouble? As you guys have learned, you learned a lot in 20, and now in 21. If you do have to be hospitalized, this is pretty substantial.
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing cases in younger people. Not that we weren't always seeing that, but I think it's a higher proportion, and perhaps people with a few less comorbidities. The brunt of the epidemic early on was the nursing homes, right? So elderly, frail people living in close proximity to another, and it really decimated that population. So we're not seeing that as much because they're fully vaccinated. So. And, I think we've learned a lot, as Dr. Ybarra said, about different treatments, prevention, but once somebody's in the hospital, like they'll get the best care that evidence that has. But, again, when they're unvaccinated, it's not that different from when they were being treated 6 months ago.
Got it. Thank you. Dr. Ybarra, turning to you. You talked about Pfizer just getting full authorization, and that's terrific news. How about the boosters? Did the boosters, is there a learning curve here? Did it take it takes a longer, I'm going to put this in a layperson's term because I'm a layperson. Does it take longer for the initial vaccination to get its full use authorization? Is the booster a shorter period of time because it's kind of an add-on to what was already learned or what was already tested? Did I say that about right? Is that?
That's a great question. I ran this by some of my colleagues that work in the regulatory space, and I think effectively, it could go either way for the Pfizer vaccine. It's sort of unclear. They got the approval yesterday, so they're fully FDA approved for a 2-dose vaccine for 16 and up. And these the companies that are running the clinical trials are in kind of doing rolling reviews. They're submitting their data real time. So I think there's a possibility that as boosters come out, it could be an emergency use authorization for a booster, or it could be an amendment to the underlying approval in the case of Pfizer. And then Moderna is a little bit different because they're not yet fully FDA approved. All of this is sort of kind of regulatory law, and it has to do with kind of the way that the companies interact and what options the government and the FDA has. But what I think consumers and individuals should take away is that the FDA is, they are working under incredible time constraints. They're doing so much to get this data reviewed safely. They're working in collaboration with the CDC, who's reviewing all of this real time. So I know that there is this question of sort of hesitancy, and will FDA's approval kind of change? And for me, I think it's sort of a matter of semantics as a physician, talking to my patients, not as a public health physician, but as an emergency physician working one-on-one with people. I really, I'm just broadly encouraging the vaccines. And if they're ultimately boosters are recommended, which it seems like it will, no matter what pathway that is used, I'm going to encourage my patients to do it as well, because the data supports it, and it's safe, it's effective, and what we know about COVID is that it can make certain individuals really, really sick. So I hope that helps to answer that there are a couple of pathways possible, but the recommendation that I'm going to use with my patients is the same.
Got it. Thank you, Joe. Let me turn to you real quick. Brian DeSabatino from EDIS, our sponsor today, asked a question. He said, are there on-site options for employers that want to do regular testing of employees and guests? Do you know of companies that are offering that kind of service?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a ton of vendors that are out there, both those who have popped up as well as true institutional laboratory services providers that do offer turnkey services for employer groups. As I mentioned, these types of tests for surveillance really kind of come in two forms. There's the more rapid tests that have results available in a few minutes. We've seen employers design kind of holding pens for individuals who are coming in without some sort of previously identified COVID test that has a negative associated with it, allowing them to get tested and proceed into the building, or even folks that are flying in, they'll have them sent to their hotel rooms to get sent back. The second type of approach is either an on-site or via the use of telemedicine with a self-directed PCR test that gets sent either somewhere locally via local courier service or overnight to a diagnostic lab for results to get run within a few hours. The PCR test will provide the additional peace of mind. And if this is really a check and balance against already vaccinated individuals, the rapid tests provide kind of a good first line defense. Notice the weasel words here, because again, there is no such thing as a perfect type of diagnostic. There are just kind of good trade-offs between accuracy, sensitivity, specificity, and turnaround time. And then the last piece I'll add to that, which I failed to address in the slide deck, is when you are relying on other individuals to come in and provide proof of negative tests, the trust but verify approach is very much necessary, particularly when there is some sort of carrot at the other end of why they need to present that test. Without getting into details, there are a number of federal agencies and international agencies that do check and go back to labs and say, hey, we got this report from somebody that looks a little iffy. Did they actually get a test from you? And there's very hefty fines and steep penalties criminally for folks that do that. So most laboratory service providers, if you do see something like that, are more than happy to assist. There's been a lot of talk about creating some better open federation around verifying those results, but those things are going to be increasingly important here as we try to continue to get back to a trusted environment of return to normal.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Dr. Dries, back to you. Katie Wilkinson, who's our president, asks, is there a high percentage of people in Delaware who started with an initial vaccine dosage but never completed the second round of Moderna or Pfizer? And is that different from other states?
I have not seen that publicly reported. I don't think it's a high percentage. I think most people, understood the need to get 2 doses to be fully protected. And I just would say that that's particularly important with Delta variant, that, the kind of intermediate protection that we saw originally with just 1 dose appears to be much lower with Delta. But I think, there certainly are people that had side effects or immune reactions to the first dose who then didn't feel like getting the second dose. But I think this percentage is probably small. I don't have data on that.
Appreciate that. Dr. Ybarra, this comes from Tim Hausiel, who's a few blocks away, an attorney in town. And I remember my former boss, Mike Castle, saying, you know, if you're really smart, you went to law school. If you were really, really smart, you went to med school. So here's your chance to play lawyer. So he asks, with a lack of legislative mandates, what is your recommendation to the private sector on mandating vaccines and testing to their current policies?
Well, I mean, you know, again, I mentioned I'm not a public health physician, although, you know, I have tremendous respect for folks that have that expertise. You know, I approach this really from my sort of individual patient interactions that I have in the emergency department. And, you know, I am not missing any opportunity to encourage everyone to get vaccinated. So I approach it more from the grassroots angle, just by nature of my training in emergency medicine. And, you know, one thing that I'm doing both in my kind of day job at PhRMA and then my night job at the ER is, you know, every time I have an interaction with a patient or I'm having a personal interaction, you know, I feel really comfortable just asking, you know, are you vaccinated? Is there anything I can do to help you? Do you have any questions? One of the hardest things that I get, you know, and I have a hard time breaking it down is when someone says, no, I don't have any questions. And so that's something that I'm approaching more and more as we get further and further into this vaccine campaign, is people that have just made up their mind and they don't want to ask a question. So now I need to really change tactics. And I think we need to change tactics, because that's probably the population that we're currently reaching, which is people that have just made up their mind and they're not really open to having a conversation. Is how do we start to break that down and have that conversation? So, you know, I hope that helps. That's really how I approach it. Again, as an ER doc, you know, working, you know, nights and weekends and seeing people that are unfortunately coming in unvaccinated that are running into trouble. How can we help people that are still unvaccinated that are maybe in the ER with other complaints? How can we help them walk out with a vaccine?
Thank you for that. Joe, we only have another quick minute or so, and I want to then turn to all of you for a final thought. What's changed in testing over the last 18 or 20 months? What's gotten better? Have the tests improved? Are they more accurate? You hear about false positives. I know I'm giving you a big question here in a short period of time, but what are your thoughts about all that?
Yeah, just to kind of encapsulate things, in terms of PCR testing methodologies, we've seen process methodologies be refined to even, you know, more improve their status as being the gold standard. We've also seen the broader availability of still very good rapid testing options, which, you know, this was very much a Wild West type scenario 18 months ago. So while there's still a lot of advancement and a lot of development that's going, and really this next horizon are these multiplexed assays to help, again, really understand where and how the issues are with COVID. The biggest piece is you've just, like everything that's happened in this pandemic, is you've seen the maturation and kind of the industry as a whole kind of meet the call of being able to really help identify, understand, and you know, proactively mitigate issues with potential positives.
All right, Joe, so we're going to start with you here for a final comment, and then we'll go to Dr. Ybarra and then Dr. Dries to close us out. But before we do, let me again thank Brian DeSabatino and our friends at EDIS for their sponsorship of this. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. We had a number of questions come in today. And for then, again, any of you in the media that want to reach out to any of these folks individually, if you'll contact Kelly here at our at the State Chamber, we can get you connected. So Joe, any last thoughts or comments?
Yeah, again, just I'd like to thank everybody for the time today, and Dr. Ybarra and Dr. Dries for their time and insight. The quick piece that we'll have is we're going to do everything in our power to not editorialize about vaccine rates and vaccine take rates, but what we can see clinically through the data is that it's increasingly important to both encourage increased vaccination as well as use diagnostic testing as the check and balance, you know, for our overall response to this. And so again, the biggest thing we'd offer to employers is, you know, continue to optimize and address your testing strategies as part of your overall portfolio approach to hopefully also encouraging employees to get vaccinated. And then, you know, stay on top of the latest in good guidance from your respective industry groups to really figure out the best combination of, you know, flexibility, convenience, accuracy, and practicality that really allows you to be proactive in stemming the tide of COVID.
Appreciate that, Joe. And thanks again for joining us. Dr. Ybarra, I'm grateful to you coming to us from DC. Your final thoughts and recommendations.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks again for the invitation. I hope this was helpful. I know we're really drinking from a constant fire hose of information related to the pandemic, and what we say today often needs to be updated, a day or a week later. If we had done this presentation on Thursday, Pfizer wouldn't have been approved. We did it today, and I had to update my slides yesterday. So one very little example, but I think overall, continue the great work that you all are doing with your employees to focus on the pandemic, get them protected. I think one thing, that is really important that industry is very well aware of, that we're trying to just kind of share with all stakeholders, including policymakers. Of course, this pandemic is not over. It's far from over. We need to keep focusing on bringing new innovations to market. We need to support the industry in efforts to update vaccines if that's needed, or, do the clinical trials to, kind of show boosters when they're needed. New treatments are needed as well. I mentioned the change that we have had in terms of treating COVID today, very different from what it was a year ago. So I think the partnership, the collaboration with government, the work with private sector is going to be really, really important. And I think just from a DC standpoint, making sure that we have policies in place, that support that innovation, as opposed to, looking at policies that might be detrimental to that. So we have a lot of work to do on all fronts.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Dries, your final thoughts and comments. Appreciate all you do here in Delaware and at Christiana Care.
No, thank you again to everyone, and as well as my co-presenters. I think the only way to get through this, to get back to any sense of normalcy, is to get more people vaccinated. And there's probably 100 different reasons why people remain hesitant. And so I think as someone who's, if you're talking with someone trying to convince them, the most important thing you have to do is listen, and figure out, what is their issue, what is their concern. Again, I also am frustrated with the people who say they have no questions, because most people, still do, or should, continue to have an open mind. And I think, if you can approach people with that and gain that trust in terms of, you're not judging, you're you want to listen to hear what their concerns are. A lot of times you can make some progress, but it's time consuming because it really has to be almost one-on-one.
Great. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you. Thanks to everybody. Appreciate all of our members and guests joining us today for this 1 hour presentation. Grateful to everybody, grateful to our sponsor. Thank you, everybody. Be safe out there and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much. So long.